Hi, this is Tim Reedy from America Magazine, and I'm joined today by Father Michael Paul Gallagher from the Gregorian University in Rome and the author of Faith Maps, 10 Religious Explorers from Newman to Ratzinger, which has been published here in the United States by Paulus Press. Welcome, Father Michael Paul.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Now, we thought we could take the occasion, we're just speaking a couple days after the beatification of Blessed Cardinal John Henry Newman, to talk about his life and his legacy. Perhaps you could begin by introducing Blessed Cardinal Newman.
Well, where does one begin? I mean, he's one of the most famous Englishmen of the 19th century. He lived practically the whole century, 90 years. Practically half his life was a Catholic, having been an Anglican for the first half of his life. As an Anglican, he was one of the most famous leaders of a reform in the Anglican Church. And then as a Catholic, he went through various phases, and at about the age of 80, he was made a cardinal, which took away a shadow that had been on him because he had been looked on with a certain amount of disfavour in Rome for various of his publications.
Now, a lot of people point to 1845, the year of his conversion to the Catholic Church, as a major event in his life, but in your book, you look to an earlier, to his conversion to the faith, which was 1815 or 16?
Well, he says that himself in his very famous autobiography, where he was defending himself against defamation, really. And as a teenager, he was reading all sorts of liberal, atheist, intellectual philosophers, and he was rather impressed by them. And then, as part of an illness, a little bit like Ignatius Loyola in some ways, he was helped by a chaplain, an evangelical chaplain in the school that he was at, to have a discovery of God, of Christ, and he says, with a power and a reality that never left him. So his big conversion was quite young, about the age of 16.
Well, we're going to pick out a couple of his ideas to talk briefly about. One is the notion to listen to your heart, to listen to your conscience. What did he mean when he urged that upon his listeners?
Conscience was hugely central for him. And yet it's a difficult word. It was a difficult word then, it's a difficult word now. He was forever defending it as the echo of the voice of God, not necessarily directly the voice of God. But he said once, quite famously, he said, if it were not for this voice in my heart and my conscience, if I looked out at the world, I probably would be an atheist. In other words, he was, I suppose, psychologically, there's no doubt that he was pretty introspective, that he had a great sense of inner life and so on. And this is the way in which he was proposing for his particular century, that this is the road to God. Listen inwards, don't be trying to examine the design of the world from outside. He wasn't too impressed by that. Conscience for him, what can I say there? It isn't just what he called self-contemplation or self-respect or your own opinion or what you feel. It's something much bigger than yourself, but it is within you, and it is ultimately God's revelation with a small r before you meet God's revelation with a big R in Christ.
Another term that you pick out in your book is educated laity. What did he mean by that term? I mean, this was a long time before Vatican II, so it might have been kind of a novel concept. It
was. He got into some trouble for an article he wrote on consulting the laity. Very interestingly, the Pope, Pope Benedict, in his beatification homily outside Birmingham there, in, what was it, the 19th of September, he actually quoted this moment of Newman where he says, what I want is an educated laity who know where they stand, who can defend themselves, who know their way round the faith. And of course his argument way back in, it was 1859, in fact, that he wrote that rather controversial article. Now it has become a classic. But his point then was that he was a great expert in church history. In fact, he more or less said that it was history that converted him, or the history of the early centuries. But that listening or reading in the history of the early centuries, he found that the bishops were often drifting towards heresy, and it was the laity of the church that protected the truth.
Well, we actually have an article in the current issue of America looking back on that classic text. Finally, maybe you can just talk about what the legacy of Cardinal Newman is today and what he might say to Christians today.
Well, I think probably the first thing he would say is, you can arrive at the truth, you do it every day. The truth of faith is a very special version of what you do all the time. You trust every time when we turned on this microphone and found that it actually worked, we were trusting technology. So we trust all the time. Pay attention to how you trust people, how you trust all sorts of things in the everyday life. You are, if I can coin a word, you are faithing all the time. The other faith, what is special about Christian faith, is a word from beyond you, a gift towards you. You are loved into love by Christ ultimately. And so what he would be saying to us is the road to faith is through your ordinary experience. That's one of the things he'd be saying. He'd be also saying, enlarge your reason. What we call rationality has shrunk into something very cold and small. Professor Dawkins, take note. It's not just empirical. What we call reason is something deep and big. It involves your imagination. It involves your affectivity. Don't separate your reason from the rest of your humanity. And I think above all, he would be saying, in spite of everything. And he ran into what he once said, I have never expected to see such scandals in the church. What he was talking about was some of the politics around Vatican I. But ultimately he was saying, this is the tradition that we trust. In spite of everything, you need it.
Well, thank you for those words, and we want to recommend to you the book by Father Michael Paul Gallagher, and thank you for joining us.
Very kind of you, and there are at least 9 other interesting authors in the book.
Thanks very much.